Hello, my name is Cheryl Lamport and I'm a best interest assessor. I work for BCP Council in the Deprivation of Liberty Safeguards team. Today I'd like to share with you the story of a young man who I assessed, where I was exploring the restrictions that were in place for him, looking at whether they were necessary and proportionate to the risk of harm, and looking at ways that the restrictions could be reduced. I'd like to introduce you to Dan. Dan isn't his real name. This isn't a real picture of Dan, but this is a picture of somebody who could be typical of Dan. You know, a 23-year-old young man, very sociable, um, loves meeting up with people, sporty, sees his family regularly. He's got 3 jobs where he works as a volunteer. He's got a girlfriend and he has aspirations to have his own place in the future. You might ask why I was working with Dan, how I became involved in assessing him. Well, Dan also happens to have a learning disability and an autistic spectrum condition. He's been in the current care home for 4 years, since he was 19 years old. Prior to coming to the care home, he was in a residential school for young people with learning disabilities. So he was known to children's services and he transitioned over to adult services. He's been assessed as lacking capacity to decide on where to live to receive care, and there's a DOLS authorisation in place. For the purposes of today, I'm not going to discuss the capacity assessment, just to say that there was agreement that he did lack capacity to decide where to live to receive care, and that wasn't in dispute. He had a paid representative appointed to him when the DOLS authorisation was granted. And the paid representative raised some concerns to the DOLS team about the validity of the original assessment. In particular, they felt that the restrictions in place for Dan were disproportionate to the risk of harm, and Dan himself was objecting to the restrictions in place. So the representative was needing to decide whether to make an application to the Court of Protection in order for them to look at the restrictions in place. And she asked that the DOLS team undertook a review initially to see whether any of these restrictions could be reduced before deciding whether to take it to court. So I met with Dan and the care home team, and we went through the current restrictions that he was subject to. Dan had one-to-one support from 9 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock every night, every day. He was supervised at all times. He was never out of sight of staff apart from when he was in his bedroom or in the bathroom. He wasn't allowed out of the care home. He could go into the garden, but if he was to go any further afield, staff would bring him back or report him as a missing person to the police. He had a laptop that he'd purchased for himself, but he was only allowed to use it for 1 hour a day, and it had to be supervised by staff. When it wasn't in use, he had to give it back to the staff to keep in the office, and it was locked away. He was not allowed to have a mobile phone or have access to a mobile phone. Staff supervised him when he went to his work placements. He only had access to his bank card and money when he was supported by staff. His mum managed his finances as an appointee. His mum was quite influential in making decisions about what support he should receive. She didn't have court-appointed deputyship or power of attorney, but she was quite heavily involved in the decisions made about the support that he should have. And he wasn't allowed to spend any time alone with his girlfriend. So the staff were with them the whole time, monitoring their interactions. So I was really keen to find out why these restrictions were in place. I had a look at the last of Best Interest Assessors report, but I couldn't really understand from that report what the risks were, what the evidence was, and why these restrictions were needed. So I asked the care home if they could give me some further information. I was expecting to see, incident reports and behaviour records of really serious things that had happened over recent years that would justify this. When I spoke to the home, they said, well, one-to-one support was agreed when he came over from Children's Services. So our understanding was that that was put in place because of incidents that have happened when he was at school. They weren't able to tell me what those incidences were, just that they believed that he had a history of sexualised behaviour. So I went back to his social care records and tried to find out what had happened previously. And the information I found was that he had targeted younger and more vulnerable people and touched them in an inappropriate way, but there was no specific incidences of what had actually happened. He had a history of playing with younger children in a physically boisterous way. Again, there was no examples of what had happened. And when he was 17, there was an incident that was reported to the safeguarding team because he was found in the toilets kissing a female student. And it was felt that the female was more vulnerable than him, and that he had targeted her. So I asked whether or not there was any evidence within the 4 years that he's been in the care home, any concerns around his behaviours. And they said there was been no evidence of sexualised behaviour in the last 4 years. They told me that his family were really worried about him getting into trouble and getting a criminal record, and they were really keen to make sure that he continued to have the one-to-one support. It was felt, if he was to go out on his own, he may be inappropriate in public, that he may not realise that how he's coming across to people is making him vulnerable. It potentially, other people may misinterpret his actions. He may come to the attention of the police. He may get arrested for a crime. And again, it was kind of, well, what evidence have you got to support that? Has he been inappropriate in public when he's been with staff? Have you got the records of those kind of incidents that have happened? They didn't have any records of any inappropriate behaviour when he was out, and he'd never been arrested or charged with a crime. There was concerns about him being vulnerable because he'll talk to anybody. If he asks people for money, he might give it to them. He might get lost if he goes out alone. Well, is he disorientated when he goes out on his own? Well, no, he knows the local area really well, they told me. He knows the shops. He knows the local pub. He knows how to get there and back. Well, are you worried about his road safety? Is that why he can't go out on his own? Oh, no, he's fine on the roads. We've assessed his road safety, and we don't have any concerns about his road safety. But if he was to go further afield, we might be worried because we don't think that he would be able to manage a bus route. If he went to somewhere that was unfamiliar, it's unlikely that he would be able to find his way back safely. I asked about the mobile phone and was told that his family didn't want him to have a phone because he's just going to keep ringing them and pestering them all the time. He did have a phone before, it was about 2 years ago, and there were some rules that were put in place around the use of the phone, which he apparently didn't stick to. So the phone was taken away from him and he didn't have it back again. They told me that they were concerned about inappropriate social media and internet use. So I asked them whether they could give me any examples of this. They said that he'd recently asked a female under 16 to send him a photograph of herself. He'd met her in the pub and she'd given him information about her social media account. He'd gone onto that account and he'd asked her for a photograph. He hadn't asked her for a nude photograph or an inappropriate photograph. He had asked for a photograph. It's possible he didn't realise that she was under 16, or didn't realise that it might be inappropriate to ask somebody for their photograph who's a child. He'd also recently accessed adult internet sites on the home's computer. Not quite sure how he got access to the home's computer, considering that he had one-to-one support. But there was concerns that he had done this, but they'd spoken to him about it and spoke to him about the inappropriateness of using the company's computer in a communal area to be accessing these kind of sites. He accepted that. He didn't access these sites again. And staff were looking at ways in which he may be able to appropriately and safely access adult information that he wanted to see. So I asked Dan, first of all, what he thought about the restrictions in place. Because some of these restrictions, if it was me, I would feel that some of these restrictions were more serious than others and had a bigger impact on my life. But I needed to find out from Dan what he thought the restrictions were to him and what he wanted to change. This is what he told me. He said, I'm fed up of the one-to-one. I feel like I'm being singled out. Everybody else in the care home, nobody here has one-to-one apart from me. I want to have more freedom. I want to use the internet without staff watching me. I want to have a mobile phone. I want to go to work independently. I don't want the staff, and I don't want mum making decisions, all these decisions about my life. So I asked him, if you could only change two or three things, what things would you want to change first? And the first thing he said to me is, I want to have a mobile phone. Second thing, I want to go to work on my own. Third thing, I don't want my mum making decisions about my life. So this was kind of a starting point in looking at how the restrictions could be reduced. And I felt that it was important to start from what was most important to Dan. So Dan was not allowed a mobile phone. Following the assessment, we had a meeting with the social worker, the care home manager, the representative for Dan, and Dan himself, and talked about these restrictions. We looked at whether there was any rationale for the reasons why he couldn't have a mobile phone. There were still some concerns about him accessing inappropriate material on the internet that he would be able to do if it was a smartphone. So he would purchase a mobile phone for calls and texts. It would be a basic phone initially. Staff accompanying him to work. Well, the care home staff were able to talk to the people that he worked with, the managers at his places of employment. And one of the managers was quite happy for him to go there without staff support. And he'd been working there for a few years, and they supported other people that had a learning disability, and they were quite happy that the fact that they had the staff that would be able to support him there. So he didn't need one-to-one for that job. The other two jobs, the managers were not happy for him to come without the support, and the reason for that was because he could get very distracted in the job and then not actually do the job that he'd been asked to do. So in two of the jobs, the one-to-one support remained. His mom managing his finances. Well, a capacity assessment really needed to be completed to look at whether Dan could actually manage his own finances. That had never been completed. It was very unclear about whether he could in fact manage his own finances. So there was an action for the care home and the social worker to take this forward. Mom being given information about him, he was very keen for Mom not to be given all information about his life. And considering he's a 23-year-old young man, how many 23-year-olds would want Mom to know everything that's happening about them? So what was agreed is that he would decide what information he wanted the care home to share with Mom and what information he didn't want her to know. And he would he actually wrote a list of things that he was happy to share and things that he wasn't happy to share with her. Not being allowed to be with his girlfriend was something that he didn't raise at all, but it was something that I felt needed to be looked at. And what I found out was that the girlfriend also had one-to-one support, but there was a reason for her one-to-one support in relation to her own vulnerability, and so therefore that one-to-one support needed to remain in place for her, but he didn't need the one-to-one support also for when he saw his girl. But and there were some concerns about whether or not he had capacity to engage in a sexual relationship. So not necessarily in relation to his current girlfriend, but also if he was to meet somebody else in the future, is he able, does he have that capacity to engage in a sexual relationship? And the more work needed to be done around education for him prior to that assessment being completed. So again, that was more work that needed to be looked at. I've just put some case law at the bottom there, a local authority versus JB. That is case law where it looks at the information that somebody needs to be able to understand, retain, and weigh up to decide to engage in a sexual relationship. It's really helpful piece of case law. So the one-to-one support he had from 9 o'clock till 10 o'clock, that was reduced straight away. It was reduced down to 9 to 5. There was absolutely no evidence at all that he needed any one-to-one in the evening. Staff would provide it as a more distant support. So they could, it could be from a distance. They don't need to be with him constantly for those 8 hours. And there would be shared support if he went out with other people rather than one-to-one support. And the idea of this was that what we didn't want to do is to take away all of the one-to-one support at once, because this is a young man who has led, a very protected life where he's had a high level of support for a long time, and to suddenly remove that support could have quite a significant impact on him. So it was agreed that this would be a gradual process, but it would be continually reviewed with a view to reducing it further. He's not allowed out on his own. Well, actually, when he went to the social clubs, he didn't need staff with him. He just needed the transport to get there. So that's what was agreed. It was agreed that when he went to the bank or he went to shops, actually, he could go around the shop and purchase his own items. He could go to the bank and withdraw his own money, and he didn't need to have staff with him. So it was agreed that they would remain outside of the bank and outside of the shop, maybe support him at the checkout initially to see how he gets on. But again, that would be reviewed. And that also that staff would, enable him to be able to go to the local pub on his own. And again, that would be, gradually reducing the support until he was able to go independently. In relation to his laptop use, what we agreed initially was that he would have unsupervised access to his laptop, but it would be for an hour a day initially. And that was in order to kind of monitor his internet use. So although staff were not with him, they would monitor what sites that he had accessed, which he was aware of. But also there was further work that needed to be done around education around internet safety, and a mental capacity assessment regarding his understanding of internet use and potential risks. This is a really good piece of case law that came out, Re-A, Capacity, Social Media and Internet Use, and it actually lists, the judge was able to list the information that, the relevant information in relation to what somebody needed to understand and be able to weigh up. And so that actually came out following the work that I did with Dan, but I thought it was really helpful to put it on there. So did any of these things make any difference to Dan? So some of these things immediately came into effect. One of those things was the following day following our meeting, he went out and purchased a phone. Some things took much longer, to put into place. However, within a year, these are the differences to him. He was assessed as having capacity to decide on his internet use. His access to the internet is no longer restricted. Been no concerns about inappropriate use of the internet or. He's now finally got the smartphone that he wanted. He makes his own arrangements to meet friends and see family. He continues to have staff support at 2 of his jobs. He now goes to the pub on his own. He lets staff know that he's okay when he's there. He rings them to let them know when he's going to be back. He goes to his social clubs without staff. They just provide the transport to enable him to get there. And he goes into the bank and shop without staff, and staff wait outside to support him if he needs it. Staff now ask him what information he wants to share with his mom, and he's written a list. He doesn't have capacity to manage his own finances, but he is able to decide on who he wants to appoint to manage his finances for him. So he wasn't keen for his mum to manage his money, partly because that she would restrict the amount of money he had access to, which was less than what his income was. Um, and he looked into whether or not somebody else could manage his money for him, including an independent organisation. He has aspirations to move somewhere more independent. He wants to live with a small group of people and not in a care home. He's happier, he's got more freedom and independence. And when I asked the staff what difference they thought it had made, they said they had seen a huge difference in how he had grown as an adult, how more mature he had become, and how more responsible he had become. This is Dan now. So the information previously was sort of 3 years ago. We then had COVID within the last year, which had a massive impact for Dan because Dan was subject to the government restrictions in relation to care homes. He couldn't go to his voluntary work, he couldn't go to the pub, and he was pretty frustrated, really. But things have started to move forward for him. And the highlight of my week last week was when he rang me to tell me that he is moving. He has a move date. So he's moving into a supported living house. It has much better links, transport links for him to be able to get to places independently. He's going to be living with two other people who he knows and he's chosen to live with. He continues to work and he's looking into possibility of getting a new job. He's single, but he hopes not to be for too long. And his mum does still manage his money, but he was able to agree with her that a higher weekly allowance, which he could get, which he was really happy about. He's still considering whether somebody else could manage it for him, but he's going to wait until he moves. This is the end of my presentation. So if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.